The courthouse security guard watched with narrowed eyes as a young black woman walked through the metal detector at 7:30 a.m. sharp. She couldn't be more than 25, he figured, dressed in a simple black blazer and carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had seen better days. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made Officer Randy Thompson suspicious. In his 12 years working courthouse security, he'd learned to read people, and something about this woman didn't fit the usual categories he was used to seeing at the federal courthouse. What happens when the youngest federal judge in American history walks into her courtroom, and everyone assumes she's the one on trial? The answer will challenge everything you believe about justice, authority, and the dangerous assumptions we make based on appearance alone. Welcome to Voice of the Black, where justice wears many faces and respect is earned, not assumed. Before we dive into this incredible story of law, order, and the power of perseverance, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that the scales of justice should be colorblind, hit that subscribe button and join our community of truth seekers. Randy Thompson had worked security at the Theodore Roosevelt Federal Courthouse in downtown Detroit for over a decade, and he prided himself on maintaining order in one of the busiest judicial buildings in the Midwest. He'd seen everything: high-profile criminal cases, corporate lawsuits worth millions, immigration hearings that determined families' futures. But something about the young woman who just passed through his checkpoint bothered him. She was walking too confidently for someone who should be nervous about being in federal court. Most defendants, especially young ones facing serious charges, walked in with their shoulders hunched, eyes down, sometimes accompanied by worried family members or harried public defenders. This woman was different. She walked like she owned the place. Randy stepped out from behind the security station and followed at a distance. The woman turned down the hallway leading to the high-security courtrooms, the ones reserved for the most serious federal cases: drug trafficking, white-collar crime, terrorism cases. What was a young black woman doing heading toward that section of the building? She stopped in front of Courtroom 4A, the domain of Judge Patricia Morrison, who was retiring at the end of the month after 30 years on the federal bench. Randy had heard through the courthouse grapevine that Morrison's replacement had been selected, but no one seemed to know much about the new judge except that they were young, highly qualified, and would be sworn in today. The woman stood in front of the courtroom door for a moment, taking what looked like a deep breath, then pushed it open and disappeared inside. Randy frowned. Court wasn't scheduled to begin for another hour and a half. What was she doing in there? Inside Courtroom 4A, Keisha Williams stood at the back of the empty chamber, taking in the space that would soon become her professional home. At 29 years old, she was about to make history as the youngest person ever appointed to the federal bench, but the magnitude of that achievement felt both thrilling and terrifying. The courtroom was impressive, dark wood paneling, high ceilings, rows of benches for spectators. At the front, the elevated judge's bench that symbolized the authority and impartiality of the American justice system. Behind the judge's chair hung the American flag and the Michigan state flag, flanked by law books that contained centuries of legal precedent. Keisha had dreamed of this moment since she was 8 years old, sitting in a similar courtroom watching her grandmother fight an eviction notice. The elderly black judge who had presided over that case, Judge Eleanor Washington, had treated her grandmother with dignity and respect, ruling in their favor and allowing them to keep their home. That day, young Keisha had decided she wanted to be the person sitting behind that bench, wielding the power to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The journey to this moment had been extraordinary. Full scholarship to Howard University, graduating summa cum laude at 20, Harvard Law School, where she'd been editor of the Law Review, clerking for a Supreme Court justice, 5 years as a federal prosecutor, earning a reputation for being brilliant, fair, and absolutely incorruptible. At 28, she'd been nominated for the federal bench, the youngest nominee in modern history. The confirmation hearings had been brutal. Senators had questioned her experience, her temperament, her ability to handle the responsibility. Some had been more direct in their skepticism. Was she too young? Too idealistic? Did she have the gravitas necessary for such an important position? She'd answered every question with the calm professionalism that had defined her legal career, backed by her record of achievement and the endorsements of legal scholars, law enforcement officials, and civil rights leaders from across the political spectrum. When the Senate had confirmed her by a vote of 68 to 32, she'd become not just the youngest federal judge in American history, but also one of only a handful of black women to serve on the federal bench. Now, standing in her courtroom for the first time, Keisha felt the weight of all those expectations, all those barriers she'd broken, all the people who were counting on her to prove that merit mattered more than age or appearance. She walked in front of the courtroom and stood behind the judge's bench, running her fingers along the smooth surface. In a few hours, she would sit in this chair and preside over her first cases as a federal judge. But first, she wanted to spend some quiet time in the space, mentally preparing for the ceremony that would officially begin her judicial career. "Excuse me, miss." The voice came from behind her, sharp and authoritative. Keisha turned to see Randy Thompson standing in the doorway, his hand resting on his radio. "You can't be in here." "I'm sorry," Keisha replied, maintaining her calm demeanor even as she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with being challenged simply for existing in a space where someone didn't expect to see her. "Court doesn't start for another hour," Randy said, stepping into the courtroom. "You need to wait outside with everyone else." Keisha could have explained who she was, could have shown her credentials, could have asserted her authority. Instead, she chose to see how this would play out. "I'm not here for a hearing." Randy's eyes narrowed. "Then what are you doing here?" "I'm working." "Working?" Randy looked around the empty courtroom. "Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to leave. Now." Before Keisha could respond, the courtroom doors opened again and Margaret Hayes, the chief deputy clerk, entered carrying a stack of files. Margaret was a 60-year-old woman who had worked in the federal courthouse for over 30 years and knew every judge, attorney, and regular visitor by sight. "Randy, what's going on?" Margaret asked, looking back and forth between the security guard and the young woman standing behind the judge's bench. "I found her in here, Maggie. She claims she's working, but court isn't in session." Margaret looked at Keisha more closely, taking in her professional attire and the confident way she stood behind the bench. Something clicked in Margaret's mind. She'd seen the official photographs and biographical materials for the new judge, but somehow hadn't expected someone quite so young. "Miss," Margaret said carefully, "are you perhaps Judge Williams?" Keisha smiled for the first time since Randy had entered the courtroom. "Yes, I am. And you must be Mrs. Hayes. I've heard wonderful things about your work here." Randy's mouth fell open. He looked from Keisha to Margaret and back again, clearly trying to process this information. "She's what?" "Judge Williams," Margaret said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and embarrassment. "I am so sorry. We weren't expecting you quite this early. I wanted some time to get familiar with the courtroom before the swearing-in ceremony," Keisha explained. "I hope that's all right." "Of course, Your Honor. Absolutely." Margaret turned to Randy, who was still standing frozen in the middle of the courtroom. "Randy, this is Judge Keisha Williams, Judge Morrison's replacement." Randy's face flushed red. "Your Honor, I had no idea. I mean, I knew the new judge was starting today, but I didn't realize—" "It's perfectly understandable," Keisha said graciously. "I know I don't look like what people typically expect in a federal judge." The awkward moment was interrupted by the arrival of several more courthouse staff members, all coming prepared for the morning's proceedings and the swearing-in ceremony scheduled for 10 a.m. Word traveled quickly through the building that the new judge had arrived, and over the next hour, a steady stream of clerks, bailiffs, and administrators stopped by to introduce themselves. Each introduction followed a similar pattern. Initial surprise at Keisha's age and appearance, followed by polite professional courtesy, and often concluding with barely concealed amazement at her credentials and accomplishments. At 8:30 a.m., the first attorneys began arriving for the morning's docket. Keisha had moved to the small office behind the courtroom that would serve as her chambers, giving the legal professionals space to prepare for their cases, while she reviewed the files for her first official day on the bench. Through the partially open door, she could hear conversations in the courtroom, attorneys discussing strategy, clients asking nervous questions, the general buzz activity that preceded a court session. But she also heard something else, whispered conversations about the new judge. "I heard she's really young," one voice said. "How young?" another replied. 29. "Can you believe that?" 29? That's barely older than some of the defendants we represent. I wonder if she's got the experience to handle serious federal cases. Guess we'll find out soon enough. Keisha closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She'd known this would be part of the job, proving herself not just once, but over and over again with every case. Every ruling, every interaction. She'd been preparing for this challenge her entire career, but hearing it expressed so openly was still difficult. At 9 a.m., she emerged from her chambers wearing her black, judicial robe for the first time. The transformation was immediate and powerful. The robe didn't just represent her new position. It embodied the authority and responsibility of the federal judiciary. The courtroom had filled with people during the hours she'd been in her chambers. Attorneys, court staff, members of the media, and several dozen spectators who had come to witness the historic swearing-in of the youngest federal judge in American history. As Keisha walked toward the bench, conversations gradually died down. She could feel every eye in the room on her, measuring, evaluating, wondering if this young black woman could possibly be qualified for such an important position. She took her seat behind the bench and looked out at the assembled crowd. In the front row, she spotted her parents, her mother, a high school principal, beaming with pride, and her father, a postal worker, trying to look serious but unable to hide his excitement. Next to them sat her mentor, retired Judge Eleanor Washington, the woman whose dignity and fairness in a Detroit courtroom 21 years ago had inspired an 8-year-old girl to dream of becoming a judge herself. At exactly 10 a.m., Judge Morrison entered the courtroom to administer the oath of office. At 72 years old, with silver hair and 3 decades of judicial experience, Morrison presented a stark contrast to her young successor. But when she spoke about Keisha's qualifications and character, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I have seen many talented attorneys appear before me, but I have rarely encountered someone with a combination of intellect, integrity, and compassion that Judge Williams brings to this position." The oath itself was simple but profound. "I, Keisha Williams, do solemnly swear that I will administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon me as a United States District Judge, according to the best of my abilities and understanding, agreeably to the Constitution and laws of the United States. So help me God." As Keisha spoke those words, she felt the full weight of American legal history settling on her shoulders. She was joining a lineage that stretched back to the founding of the Republic, becoming part of an institution that, despite its flaws and historical injustices, remained humanity's best hope for creating a more perfect union through the rule of law. The applause that followed was warm but respectful, the kind of measured response appropriate for a solemn judicial ceremony. But Keisha could see in the faces of spectators a range of emotions: pride, curiosity, skepticism, and hope. Judge Morrison concluded the ceremony with a few personal remarks. "Judge Williams," she said, "this courtroom has seen history made many times over the past 30 years. Today, it witnesses history again. I have complete confidence that you will honor the traditions of this court while bringing your own unique perspective and abilities to bear on the cases that will come before you." As the ceremony concluded and people began to file out of the courtroom, many stopped to congratulate Keisha and wish her well. The attorneys who would be appearing before her seemed to be taking her measure, trying to get a sense of her judicial temperament and approach to the law. But not everyone was convinced. As the crowd thinned, Keisha overheard a conversation between 2 veteran defense attorneys near the back of the courtroom. She seems nice enough, one was saying, but federal court isn't a place for on-the-job training. Some of these cases involve life sentences, major corporate disputes, constitutional issues that affect millions of people. I heard she was a prosecutor, the other replied. That probably means she'll be tough on defendants. Young prosecutors trying to make names for themselves usually are. Maybe, but being a prosecutor and being a judge are completely different jobs. We'll see if she can handle the transition. Keisha pretended not to hear the conversation, but their words stung because they reflected concerns she'd been battling throughout her confirmation process and that she knew would follow her throughout her judicial career. She would be held to a different standard, scrutinized more carefully, given less margin for error than older, more traditional appointees. By 11 a.m., the ceremonial aspects of the morning were over, and it was time for Keisha to begin her actual work as a federal judge. Her first case was a sentencing hearing for a white-collar crime, a corporate executive who had embezzled $2.3 million from his company's pension fund. As the defendant's attorneys and the prosecution team assembled before her bench, Keisha could see the surprise and uncertainty in their faces. They had been preparing for this hearing for months, but they had been expecting to appear before Judge Morrison, not before the youngest federal judge in American history. The defense attorney, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s named Robert Carstairs, seemed particularly unsettled. He kept glancing at Keisha as if trying to reconcile her youthful appearance with her judicial authority. "Your Honor," Carstairs began, "before we proceed, I want to express my congratulations on your appointment and welcome you to the federal bench." "Thank you, Mr. Carstairs," Keisha replied evenly. "Shall we proceed with the sentencing hearing?" What followed was a masterclass in judicial temperament. Keisha had studied this case thoroughly, reviewing not just the facts and legal precedents, but also the defendant's background, the impact on victims, and the broader implications for deterrence and justice. The defendant, Thomas Bradford, was a 53-year-old man who had systematically stolen from the retirement accounts of over 200 workers at a manufacturing plant in suburban Detroit. His actions had devastated families who were counting on those funds for their retirement security. As Keisha listened to the arguments from both sides, the prosecution seeking a significant prison sentence, the defense arguing for leniency based on Bradford's lack of prior criminal history and his cooperation with investigators, she displayed the kind of thoughtful, measured approach that had impressed her Senate Confirmation Committee. When it came time for her to speak, Keisha addressed not just the specifics of Bradford's case, but the broader principles at stake. "Mr. Bradford," she said, looking directly at the defendant, "you held a position of trust. The workers whose retirement funds you stole trusted you to protect their financial security. When you violated that trust, you didn't just steal money. You stole peace of mind, dignity, and hope for the future." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "The sentence I impose today must reflect not only the seriousness of your crimes, but also the need to deter others who might be tempted to abuse similar positions of trust." Keisha sentenced Bradford to 4 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay full restitution to his victims. The sentence was within federal guidelines, neither lenient nor harsh, but carefully calibrated to serve the interests of justice. After the hearing concluded, she could see the attorneys reassessing their initial impressions. Robert Carstairs, who had seemed skeptical at the beginning, approached the bench as the courtroom cleared. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "that was an excellent ruling. Thoughtful, well-reasoned, and fair." "Thank you, Mr. Carstairs. I appreciate that. If I may say so, Your Honor, I've been practicing in this court for 25 years, and I've rarely seen a judge handle their first sentencing hearing with such composure and insight." The compliment meant more to Keisha than she let on, coming as it did from an experienced attorney who had initially seemed doubtful about her qualifications. Over the next few days, word spread throughout Detroit's legal community about the new federal judge who was exceeding expectations. But Keisha knew that one good hearing did not make a judicial career, and she remained focused on steady work of building her reputation case by case. Her third day on the bench brought a different kind of challenge. A high-profile criminal case involving a group of defendants accused of operating a major drug trafficking ring. The case had been in the news for months, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and curious spectators. As Keisha entered the courtroom and took her seat, she was immediately aware of the heightened tension in the room. This wasn't a white-collar crime with a single defendant. This was a complex case with multiple defendants, some of whom were facing potential life sentences. The lead prosecutor was Maria Santos, a veteran federal prosecutor in her 40s who had successfully handled dozens of major drug cases. Across from her sat a team of defense attorneys, each representing different defendants in what would likely be a months-long trial. But before the substantive legal proceedings could begin, there was an uncomfortable moment that reminded Keisha and everyone else in the courtroom of the unusual circumstances of her appointment. One of the defendants, a 24-year-old man named Darius Coleman, looked up at Keisha on the bench and then leaned over to whisper something to his attorney. The whispered conversation grew more animated, and finally Coleman's lawyer, a middle-aged black woman named Patricia Jackson, requested permission to approach the bench. "Your Honor," Jackson said quietly, "my client has expressed some concern about the appropriateness of this proceeding." Keisha raised an eyebrow. What kind of concern? But the recognition she treasured most came from an unexpected source. Judge Patricia Morrison, her predecessor, invited her to lunch on the first anniversary of her swearing-in. "Keisha," Morrison said as they sat in a quiet restaurant near the courthouse, "I want you to know something. In 30 years on the bench, I never had a successor who handled the transition with such grace and competence." "Thank you, Judge Morrison. That means more than you know." Morrison smiled. "When I first learned about your appointment, I'll admit I had concerns. Not about your qualifications. Those were impeccable, but about whether the legal community would accept such a young judge. I worry that you'd face unfair scrutiny and that it might undermine your effectiveness." She paused to sip her coffee before continuing. "I was wrong to worry. You haven't just met expectations, you've exceeded them. You brought fresh energy to that courtroom while maintaining the dignity and seriousness that federal court requires. You've proven that wisdom and experience aren't just about age. They're about preparation, integrity, and commitment to justice." As they talked, Morrison shared stories from her own early days on the bench. The mistakes she'd made, the challenges she'd faced, the lessons she'd learned. It was a conversation between two judges separated by 4 decades in age, but united by their commitment to the law and their determination to serve justice fairly. "The legal system is imperfect," Morrison said as their lunch concluded. "It's been shaped by centuries of history, including some very dark chapters. But it's also capable of evolution, of becoming more just and more inclusive. Judges like you are part of that evolution." Walking back to the courthouse after lunch, Keisha reflected on the year that had passed since that morning when Randy Thompson had questioned her presence in the building. She thought about the attorneys who had initially seemed skeptical, but now treated her with obvious respect. She thought about the defendants who had appeared before her bench and received fair trials regardless of their race, age, or background. She thought about the young people who had written to tell her that her example had inspired them to pursue careers in law. Most of all, she thought about 8-year-old Keisha Williams, sitting in a Detroit courtroom watching Judge Eleanor Washington preside with dignity and fairness over her grandmother's case. That little girl had dreamed of someday sitting behind the bench, wielding the power of law in service of justice. The dream had seemed impossibly distant then, but persistence, preparation, and principle had made it reality. As she entered the courthouse, Randy Thompson looked up from his security station and smiled. "Good afternoon, Your Honor. How was lunch?" "Very nice, Randy. Thank you for asking." The interaction was brief and professional, but it represented something larger: the evolution of relationships, the power of time and demonstrated competence to change perceptions, the possibility of moving from suspicion to respect through the simple act of doing excellent work. That afternoon, Keisha had 3 hearings scheduled: a civil rights lawsuit, a corporate fraud case, and a sentencing hearing for a drug offense. Each case required careful attention to legal precedent, constitutional principles, and human consequences of judicial decisions. As she put on her judicial robe and prepared to enter the courtroom, Keisha thought about the responsibility she carried, not just to decide cases fairly, but to represent a possibility that the American justice system could be truly just that, the bench could be occupied by people of all backgrounds, that excellence and integrity mattered more than age or appearance. The courtroom was full, as it usually was these days. Attorneys had learned that Judge Williams ran an efficient, fair courtroom where cases were decided based on law and evidence rather than personalities or politics. Law students and young attorneys often attended her hearings to observe her judicial style and learn from her approach to complex legal issues. As Keisha took her seat behind the bench and looked out at the assembled crowd, she saw the same mixture of faces she'd encountered throughout her judicial career. Some familiar, others new, all representing the diversity and complexity of American society. Some looked at her with obvious respect and admiration. Others seemed more skeptical or uncertain. A few appeared to be sizing her up, trying to determine whether this young black woman really had the wisdom and authority to make decisions that would affect their lives, their fortunes, their freedom. She had learned not to take any of these reactions personally. Skepticism was natural when people encountered something unexpected. What mattered was how she responded to that skepticism. Not with defensiveness or anger, but with a quiet confidence that came from thorough preparation and unwavering commitment to justice. "Court is now in session," she announced, bringing the gavel down with the same firm authority that had surprised so many people over the past year. The Honorable Keisha Williams presiding. As the first case was called and attorneys began their arguments, Keisha reflected on how much had changed since that morning, when everyone had assumed she was in the wrong place. The work of justice continued, case by case, ruling by ruling, decision by decision. And she was exactly where she belonged, behind the bench, serving the cause of justice, proving that excellence knows no boundaries and that the American dream of equal opportunity under law was still possible for those willing to work for it. The young woman who had been mistaken for a defendant had become a guardian of the Constitution, a protector of rights, a symbol of what America could be when it lived up to its highest ideals. And in courtrooms across the country, other young people who didn't look like traditional judges were watching, learning, and preparing to follow in her footsteps. Because justice, Keisha had learned, wasn't just about following the law. It was about expanding the definition of who could serve the law, ensuring that the scales of justice were held by hands that reflected the full diversity of American society, and proving that the content of one's character and the quality of one's mind mattered far more than the color of one's skin or the number of years one had lived. Never judge a book by its cover, and never assume someone's capabilities based on their age, race, or gender. The person you underestimate today might be the one holding the scales of justice tomorrow. Excellence speaks louder than assumptions. Competence trumps stereotypes, and integrity overcomes prejudice. The American justice system is only as strong as the people who serve it, and it grows stronger every time we expand our definition of who deserves the opportunity to serve. Justice truly is blind to everything except the law, the evidence, and the eternal human struggle to create a more perfect union where everyone has an equal chance to prove their worth.